The scent arrived 3 seconds before the footsteps. Elena Ashford froze with her hands submerged in scalding dishwater, every muscle in her body going rigid. She did not need to look. She did not need to hear the heavy boots crossing the stone floor above. Her entire nervous system recognized that presence before conscious thought could catch up. Wild cedar and leather, gunpowder residue, something older underneath, primal and commanding. The scent that had haunted her for 10 years. Alpha King Garrett Stone was in the castle. The massive oak mixing bowl slipped from her soapy fingers and struck the basin with a clatter that made 3 other kitchen maids jump. Mistress Hannah glanced up from the bread she was kneading, her weathered face creasing with disapproval. Elena did not wait for the reprimand. She stripped off her soaked apron with movements that had become muscle memory over a decade of practice, hung it on the iron hook beside the brick oven, and slipped through the servant's door before anyone could question her. The narrow corridor beyond smelled of old stone and winter cold. Elena moved through it with the fluid silence of someone who had mapped every creaking floorboard, every loose stone, every shadow deep enough to hide in. Routes she had memorized the way soldiers memorize escape plans, because that was what she was, a soldier in a war only she knew she was fighting. She emerged into the frost-covered herb garden just as her lungs began to burn from holding her breath. The January morning air hit her face like a physical blow, sharp and merciless. Snow had fallen during the night, transforming the garden into something pristine and deceptively peaceful. Elena's breath misted in front of her as she pressed her back against the cold stone wall of the garden shed, her heart hammering against her ribs. 10 years of this. 10 years of running whenever that scent appeared. 10 years ensuring their paths never crossed directly, that those amber eyes never focused on her long enough to truly see what she was. Because Elena knew with a certainty that terrified her what would happen if Alpha King Garrett Stone ever stopped to really look at the kitchen maid who fled whenever he came near. Everything would collapse. She rested her head against the rough stone and forced herself to breathe slowly, deliberately, in through the nose, hold, out through the mouth. The breathing technique her mother had taught her when she was 12, when panic attacks first started after her father's death. Before Silas Mordain arrived in their kingdom with his charming smile and silver tongue, before everything shattered, the memory surfaced unbidden, sharp-edged and cutting. Her mother's face, still beautiful even wasted by poison, trying to smile as she lay dying in that enormous canopied bed. Elena had been 15, old enough to understand what was happening, too young to stop it. Silas had spent 3 years worming his way into the widowed queen's trust, presenting himself as a powerful mage who could help secure their borders, strengthen their defenses. The marriage had seemed logical to the court, strategic. The queen had been drowning under the weight of ruling alone, and Silas offered strength, experience, magical power. He had wanted the crown, not the woman. The moment the wedding vows were spoken, the queen became disposable. Elena's hands clenched into fists. She had watched her mother waste away over 18 months. After the funeral, Silas locked Elena in her chambers. For her own protection, he told the court. The months turned into years, 15 to 22, 7 years in a gilded cage, watching the world through a narrow window while Silas consolidated his power and signed threats to neighboring kingdoms in her name. The sound of boots on gravel snapped Elena back to the present. She went absolutely still. Someone was walking through the garden. Heavy footsteps, measured, military, precise. The kind of gait that came from decades of combat training and battlefield command. No. Elena eased around the corner of the shed, moving with the silent caution of prey avoiding a predator. Her eyes found him immediately. He stood 30 yards away in the center of the garden path, his broad shoulders blocking out the weak winter sun. Garrett Stone, Alpha King, commander of the Northern Territories. the man who had ended the 20-year border war through sheer tactical brilliance and overwhelming force, and her mate. The bond thrummed between them even at this distance, an invisible cord of recognition that her wolf could feel despite never having fully manifested. Elena had spent her entire adult life believing she was broken, that whatever supernatural ability should have awakened in her bloodline had been damaged by trauma or imprisonment. But the moment she had arrived in this kingdom 10 years ago, 22 years old and half-starved and desperate, and caught the scent of the Alpha King for the first time, something had stirred deep in her chest, something that whispered mine with a certainty that transcended logic. She pressed herself tighter against the stone wall and watched him through the bare branches of a winter rosebush, 40 years old, though he carried it like a man carved from granite rather than worn down by time. Tall enough that most men had to look up to meet his eyes, shoulders that could carry the weight of a kingdom and still stand straight, dark hair touched with silver at the temples, a face that would have been handsome if not for the hard lines carved by violence and loss. The scars told stories Elena had pieced together from 10 years of listening to kitchen gossip and stolen glances at military records in the castle library. The thin white line across his left eyebrow from a blade that had nearly taken his eye during the Battle of Thornmere Pass, the puckered tissue on his right hand from wolf claws in close combat, the way he favored his left leg on cold mornings, legacy of a shattered kneecap that had healed wrong before he could get proper medical attention. But it was the scar she could not see that defined him most, the one carved into his heart 10 years ago when his mate Sarah fell in battle. Elena had heard the story whispered in kitchens, traded in hushed conversations among servants who remembered. The Alpha King's Luna, brilliant and fierce, leading a border patrol that walked into an ambush. 20 warriors against nearly 100. Sarah had held the line long enough for her team to escape, buying their retreat with her life. Garrett had been 300 miles away, commanding a separate campaign, when word reached him. They said he shifted instantly, ran for 2 days straight without stopping, arrived to find her body already prepared for burial. They said his howl of grief could be heard for miles, that he stood vigil over her for 3 days, refusing food, refusing water, refusing everything except the crushing weight of loss. And then he had stood up, buried his mate with full military honors, and returned to winning the war. Because that was what commanders did. They carried their grief privately and continued protecting the people who depended on them. Elena understood that kind of strength, the kind that came from having no choice but to endure. She had learned it in that room where Silas kept her locked away, learned that survival sometimes meant putting one foot in front of the other long after hope had died. Maybe that was why the mate bond felt so inevitable. 2 people who had learned to function while broken, recognizing something in each other that transcended logic or reason or political reality. A warrior king. That was what the people called him. A man who had earned his throne through blood and tactical genius rather than inheritance. Elena's chest tightened with something that felt dangerously close to longing. He turned suddenly, his head coming up like a wolf scenting prey. Those amber eyes swept the garden with the methodical precision of someone trained to spot threats in empty spaces. Elena stopped breathing entirely. She was hidden behind the shed and the rose bushes, but she had learned over 10 years that Garrett Stone's senses went far beyond normal human perception. He could track scent trails days old, hear heartbeats through stone walls, feel the presence of other wolves like pressure changes before a storm. For 5 eternal seconds his gaze passed within inches of where she hid. Then he turned and walked back toward the castle, his boots crunching through frost-covered gravel in a rhythm that sounded like a countdown. Elena waited until he disappeared through the oak doors before she allowed herself to collapse against the wall, her legs suddenly too weak to hold her weight. Her hands were shaking. Her heart felt like it might crack her ribs. 10 years, and the effect had not dulled. If anything, it had grown stronger, more dangerous. The pull toward him was a physical ache now, a constant whisper beneath her thoughts that said, "Go to him, be near him, let him see you." She could not, she would not. Because Elena Ashford was not just a fugitive kitchen maid. She was the enemy, the woman whose name had been used to threaten this kingdom with war for a decade. The princess who, as far as anyone in Garrett's court knew, sat in her castle making demands and signing treaties that pushed both kingdoms closer to open conflict. Silas had been thorough in his deception. He kept Elena's escape secret, spreading carefully crafted rumors that the princess preferred privacy, that she ruled from seclusion. The court of her birth kingdom believed it. The neighboring kingdoms believed it. And every threatening letter, every impossible demand, every provocation carried her signature. If Garrett Stone discovered who she really was, he would have every reason to throw her in his dungeons as a spy and a threat. The irony was too bitter to fully process. She had found her mate in the one man who could never accept her. Elena pushed herself upright and started back toward the kitchen. The morning rush would be starting soon. Breakfast for 300 people did not prepare itself, and Mistress Hannah had no patience for maids who disappeared during peak hours. She had taken perhaps a dozen steps when she heard her name, not her real name, the false one she had used for 10 years. Rose. Elena turned to find Marcus Thorne standing in the garden archway, his lean frame silhouetted against the morning light. Garrett's spy master. The man who saw everything and forgot nothing. He was perhaps 50, with iron-gray hair and the kind of face that could blend into any crowd until he chose to be noticed. His pale blue eyes were fixed on her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "Rose," he said again, "the king requests your presence in the war room, immediately." Elena's blood turned to ice water. In 10 years she had never been summoned by the king, never been noticed by anyone of rank. She had been invisible, forgettable. One kitchen maid among dozens. "I am sure there is some mistake," she managed. "I am nobody. I have no business in the war room." Marcus took 3 steps closer. "No mistake. The king has been very clear. He wants to speak with you. Now." "About what?" The words came out sharper than she intended. Something that might have been amusement flickered across Marcus's face. "That is between you and his majesty. But I would not keep him waiting if I were you. Garrett Stone is many things, but patient is not among them." Elena's mind raced through possibilities, each worse than the last. He knew. Somehow Garrett had discovered her identity, and this was the arrest. Or worse, Silas had sent word that the princess had been located and demanded her return. There was no good reason for a king to summon a kitchen maid. "Lead the way," Elena said quietly, because running now would only confirm whatever suspicions had been raised. Marcus nodded and turned without another word. Elena followed him through corridors she knew by heart, but had never walked during daylight hours. Past the great hall where nobility took their meals. Through the gallery lined with portraits of previous rulers. Up the sweeping main staircase that servants were supposed to use only when cleaning. People stared. A junior steward. 2 ladies in waiting who giggled behind their hands. A cluster of guards who watched her pass with expressions ranging from curious to suspicious. Elena kept her head down and her steps steady, even though her heart was trying to beat its way out of her chest. The war room occupied the eastern tower, a circular chamber with windows that overlooked the training grounds and the forests beyond. Maps covered every wall. A massive oak table dominated the center of the space, its surface scarred by decades of military planning. Garrett Stone stood with his back to the door, studying a detailed map of the border territories. He did not turn when Marcus opened the door. "Your Majesty," Marcus said with a slight bow. "The woman you requested." Garrett continued studying the map for another 10 seconds. When he finally turned, the full weight of those amber eyes hit Elena like a physical force. She had seen him before, dozens of times over 10 years, but always from a distance, always hidden, never like this, with nothing between them but 20 feet of empty space and air that suddenly felt too thick to breathe. "Leave us," Garrett said to Marcus without breaking eye contact with Elena. The spymaster hesitated. Your Majesty, protocol suggests that a chaperone should be present when meeting with an unmarried woman alone. I said, leave us. The words were quiet, but carried the unmistakable edge of command that had won battles and ended rebellions. Marcus bowed and withdrew, closing the heavy oak door behind him with a soft click that sounded like a cell door locking. Elena stood perfectly still in the center of the room, her hands clasped in front of her to stop them from shaking. Garrett circled her slowly, his steps measured and deliberate, studying her the way a general studied enemy fortifications looking for weaknesses. 10 years, he said finally, his voice rougher than it had been a moment ago. 10 years you have been working in my kitchens. 10 years I have caught your scent in corridors and gardens. 10 years of you vanishing like smoke every time I came within 50 yards. Elena said nothing. There was nothing safe to say. Do you know what that does to a wolf? Garrett stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. To catch the scent of your mate and have her run from you for 10 years? Elena's heart stopped. He knew, not about her identity, but about the bond. I did not know I had the right to call you my mate, she said quietly. I am nobody, a kitchen maid with no family and no name. You are a king. Garrett's jaw tightened. I have spent the last 6 months investigating you. Every rumor, every whisper, every ghost story about the woman who appeared 10 years ago with no references and no past. Do you know what my spy master found? Elena forced herself to meet his eyes. What did he find? That you are far more educated than any kitchen maid has a right to be. That you read military strategy texts from the library when you think no one is watching. That you speak 4 languages fluently. That you have the bearing and posture of someone trained from childhood in courtly manners. He took another step closer. Elena held her ground even though every instinct screamed at her to run. And 6 days ago, Garrett continued, his voice dropping to something dangerous, my spymaster received confirmation of something we have suspected for months. The mysterious kitchen maid who has been hiding in my castle for 10 years is Princess Elena Ashford, daughter of the murdered Queen Catherine, the woman whose name has been used to threaten my kingdom for nearly a decade. The world tilted. Elena's vision tunneled. He knew everything. Are you going to deny it? Garrett asked. Elena drew a shaky breath and lifted her chin. Would you believe me if I did? No. Then there is no point in lying. She met his eyes steadily, even though hers were burning with unshed tears. Yes, I am Elena Ashford. I am the princess your kingdom considers its enemy. I have been hiding here since I escaped Silas Mordain's imprisonment 10 years ago, and every threat, every demand, every provocation that has been signed with my name is a lie. Her voice cracked on the last words. The tears she had been holding back spilled over. I came here because I had nowhere else to go. Because I thought if I could just stay invisible, if I could just survive, maybe someday I could find a way to reclaim what was stolen. But I never meant to deceive you. I never meant to become your problem. And I certainly never meant to be your mate. Silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. Garrett's face was unreadable. His eyes searched hers with an intensity that felt like being flayed open. Before he could speak, before Elena could brace herself for whatever came next, the war room door burst open with enough force to crack the doorframe. A woman strode in without being announced, beautiful in the way a blade was beautiful. Blonde hair arranged in perfect curls, a gown of deep burgundy that clung to curves deliberately displayed, cold blue eyes that swept the room and landed on Elena with recognition that turned immediately into vicious satisfaction. Victoria Thornwick. Well, Victoria said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. Is this not interesting? The little kitchen maid who has been skulking in shadows turns out to be royalty. How absolutely unexpected. Lady Victoria, Garrett's voice carried a warning edge. You were not given permission to enter this room. Victoria waved a dismissive hand. Oh, forgive me, Your Majesty, but I come bearing news that could not wait. You see, I received a most interesting letter this morning from Lord Silas Mordain. He sends his regards and wanted me to deliver a message personally. She pulled a folded parchment from her bodice and held it up like a trophy. "It seems Lord Silas is aware that his dear stepdaughter has been hiding in your castle," Victoria continued, her smile growing sharper. "And he has a proposal. Return Princess Elena to him by the next full moon, or he will consider her presence in your kingdom an act of war. He has already mobilized his forces along the border, 10,000 men ready to march at his command." Elena felt the blood drain from her face. Silas knew. He had known for who knew how long, and he had been waiting, planning, positioning his pieces like a master playing chess. Garrett's expression remained perfectly controlled, but Elena saw his hands clench into fists at his sides. "Oh, it gets better," Victoria said. "Lord Silas also mentions that he would be willing to forgive this little incident if you agree to certain treaty terms. Territorial concessions, trade agreements heavily weighted in his favor, and of course the immediate return of the princess." She looked directly at Elena. "I imagine you will be very popular when you return home," Victoria said. 10 years of threats signed in your name. 10 years of escalating tensions. I am sure your people will be thrilled to have their princess back." Elena could not breathe. The trap was perfect. If Garrett returned her to Silas, she would be executed as a traitor. If he refused, Silas would use it as justification for war, and if she ran, she would be hunted by both kingdoms. There was no way out. Garrett turned to face Victoria fully, and something in his posture made even the confident noblewoman take a half-step back. "Tell me, Lady Victoria, when did you become Silas Mordain's messenger?" Victoria's smile faltered. "I am merely trying to prevent unnecessary bloodshed, Your Majesty. I see that you arrived in my castle 3 days ago, uninvited, and immediately began stirring up trouble," Garrett said. "I also see that you have taken a rather intense interest in a certain kitchen maid, almost as if you knew exactly who she was before you arrived." Victoria's face went carefully blank. "I am sure I do not know what you are implying." "I am implying that you are working for Silas Mordain, that this entire visit was orchestrated to flush out Princess Elena. The question is why? What does Silas have on you, Victoria?" "Nothing." Victoria's voice went sharp. "I am loyal to this realm and to its king." "Then you will have no objection to being confined to your quarters while I investigate these accusations," Garrett said. "Guards." The door opened immediately. 2 heavily armed soldiers stepped inside. "Escort Lady Victoria to the East Wing and ensure she remains there until further notice. She is not to leave her rooms or communicate with anyone outside the castle." "You cannot do this," Victoria hissed. "I am a noblewoman of this court. My father is one of your most powerful allies." "Your father is 300 miles away and has no idea what you have been doing in his name," Garrett said. "Now go." The guards moved forward. Victoria looked between them and Garrett, seemed to realize she had no winning move, and allowed herself to be escorted from the room. The door closed behind her with a solid thud. Elena stood frozen in the center of the room, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. Garrett had defended her, protected her, refused the demand to hand her over. Why? The word came out barely above a whisper. Garrett turned to face her. "Because you are my mate. Because I have spent 10 years knowing something was missing from my life and not understanding what it was until I saw you at the kitchen door 3 months ago and realized the woman I had been searching for was the one who kept running from me." He crossed the distance between them in 3 strides and cupped her face in his hands, his touch surprisingly gentle. "Because even if you were not my mate," he continued, "I would not hand an innocent woman over to a murderer. Because your kingdom is not my enemy, Silas Mordain is. And because I am tired of losing people I care about to wars started by cowards who hide behind lies." Elena saw it then, in his eyes. The grief he carried. This was a man who had lost his first mate in combat 10 years ago, who had watched soldiers under his command die, who carried the weight of every decision, every casualty, every impossible choice. The tears came harder now, years of fear and loneliness and desperate hope finally breaking through. "I do not know how to do this. I have been alone for so long." Garrett pressed his forehead to hers. Then we will figure it out together. But first, we need to deal with the immediate problem. Silas has given us until the next full moon. That is 28 days. Elena pulled back slightly to meet his eyes. You are not actually considering giving me to him. Garrett's voice was absolute. But we need to be strategic about this. Silas is expecting me to either hand you over or refuse and face war. We need a third option. Like what? Like publicly claiming you as my mate and future queen. Like announcing that any attack on you is an attack on this kingdom. Like forcing Silas to either back down or openly declare war not on a fugitive princess, but on the Alpha King and his Luna. Elena's breath caught. That would mean exposing everything, admitting who I am in front of your entire court. Yes, Garrett said simply. It would also mean trusting me to protect you, trusting that this court will listen when you tell them the truth. And if they do not believe me? Then we fight, Garrett said, together. Elena studied his face, searching for any hint of doubt or deception. She found only fierce certainty and something that looked dangerously close to hope. This man barely knew her, had only discovered her identity 6 days ago, and he was willing to risk war, risk his throne, risk everything for a woman who had been hiding in his kitchens, because of the mate bond, because his wolf recognized her as his other half, or maybe because Garrett Stone was the kind of man who protected people who needed protecting, who saw injustice and moved to correct it, who built his kingdom on honor rather than fear. I need time to think, Elena said finally. You have until tomorrow morning, Garrett replied. There is a ball scheduled for tomorrow night. I was going to announce my choice of bride from among the noble ladies who have been circling like vultures. Instead, I am going to announce that I have found my mate, that you are under my protection, that anyone who threatens you answers to me. He released her face but caught her hands in his. But I will not do it without your consent, Elena. If you want to run, if you want to find another way, I will help you. I will not force this on you. Elena looked down at their joined hands. His were scarred and calloused from decades of combat. Hers were rough from 10 years of kitchen work. Two people who should never have met, let alone recognized each other across the impossible distance between royalty and servitude. But the bond thrummed between them, insistent and undeniable. I will give you my answer tomorrow morning, she said quietly. Garrett nodded and released her hands. Marcus will escort you back. And Elena? She paused at the door, looking back at him. For what it is worth, Garrett said, his amber eyes holding hers. I am glad it is you. I am glad that after 10 years of believing I would never find another mate, the woman the moon chose for me is someone who survived imprisonment and still managed to stay kind. Someone who learned to be invisible and still helped every person around her. Someone strong enough to run and smart enough to know when to stand and fight. His words cracked something open in Elena's chest, some door she had kept locked for so long she had forgotten it existed. She fled before he could see her cry again. Marcus was waiting in the corridor outside. He led her back through the castle without speaking, taking routes that avoided the main halls and curious eyes. When they reached the door to the kitchen wing, he paused. For what it is worth, he said quietly, I have been advising Garrett Stone for 15 years. I have seen him make brilliant tactical decisions and catastrophic personal ones. But this is the first time in a decade I have seen him look like he might remember how to be happy. Elena studied the spymaster's weathered face. You knew, she said, 6 months ago. How long before that did you suspect? Marcus's expression did not change, but something flickered in those pale eyes. I first noticed inconsistencies about a year after you arrived. A kitchen maid who flinched at the mention of border conflicts, who read diplomatic treaties in 3 different languages when she thought no one was watching, who understood military formations well enough to correct errors in historical texts. You could have exposed me at any time. I could have, Marcus agreed. But I serve my king's best interests, and my king needed to find his mate. 10 years of watching him search, 10 years of seeing him pull away from every noble woman presented to him. I began to suspect the reason was already in this castle, and you said nothing. I said nothing because sometimes the greatest service a spy master can provide is knowing when not to act. He met her eyes directly. Garrett Stone is a good king, a brilliant commander, but he has been half alive since Sarah died, functional, effective, but not whole. When I finally confirmed your identity 6 days ago, I knew I had a choice. Protect him from a potential threat, or give him a chance at the one thing he thought he had lost forever. Which did you choose? I arranged for him to see you in the kitchen doorway 3 months ago. Close enough to catch your scent fully for the first time in 10 years. Close enough to understand what he had been searching for all along. Marcus's voice softened slightly. The rest was his choice. And yours. Elena felt tears pricking her eyes again. Why tell me this now? Because tomorrow you will make a decision that affects not just you and the king, but 2 kingdoms and everyone who depends on them. Marcus's expression turned serious. You need to understand that Garrett Stone does not offer protection lightly. He does not make promises he cannot keep, and he does not claim mates he is unwilling to fight for. If you accept him tomorrow night, you accept everything that comes with it, the war, the throne, the responsibility. And if I run instead? Then I will help you disappear so thoroughly that even Silas will never find you, Marcus said simply, because that is what my king would want. Your safety, your choice, even if it breaks something in him that will never fully heal. The words hung in the air between them. You love him, Elena said quietly. Not romantically, but you love him like a brother, like family. I have served Garrett Stone for 15 years. I have watched him make impossible decisions, sacrifice his own happiness for the good of his people, carry grief that would have destroyed lesser men. He deserves joy, Princess Elena. He deserves someone who sees him not as a king or a commander or a tactical asset, but as a man who has been alone too long. Marcus stepped back, his professional mask sliding back into place. Whatever you decide tomorrow, make it with full understanding of what you are choosing, and know that either path will require more courage than most people possess in a lifetime. Then he was gone, leaving Elena alone in the dim corridor with impossible decisions and a heart that would not stop trying to convince her that staying might not be the catastrophic mistake her mind insisted it was. She slipped back into the kitchen where Mistress Hannah immediately assigned her to the evening meal preparations. Hours passed in the familiar rhythm of chopping vegetables and stirring pots. The other maids whispered about seeing her being escorted through the castle by the spy master himself, but Elena deflected every question. The work was mindless, mechanical. It left too much space for thinking. 10 years she had been here. 10 years of safety purchased through invisibility. 10 years of watching Garrett Stone from a distance, feeling that pull toward him, that certainty that he was hers, even though claiming that right would destroy everything. And now he was offering her a choice, not demanding, not commanding, offering. That alone made him different from every other man who had held power over her life. Her father had been loving but distant, too consumed by ruling to truly see her. Silas had been a monster who saw her only as a tool, a pawn, something to be controlled and used. But Garrett looked at her and saw a person, saw someone worth protecting, not because of what she could offer him politically, but simply because she mattered. Because of the mate bond, yes, but also because of who he was, the kind of man who had built a kingdom on honor rather than fear. Around her, the kitchen bustled with evening preparations, bread baking, meat roasting, sauces simmering, the sounds and smells that had defined her life for a decade. Safe, predictable, small. Was that enough anymore? Had it ever been? That night, alone in her tiny room in the servants' quarters, Elena pulled out the only possessions she had kept from her old life. The dress her mother had commissioned for her 16th birthday, midnight blue with golden embroidery, the shoes that matched, the emerald necklace that had belonged to 3 generations of queens before her mother. She laid them on her narrow bed and tried to imagine walking into that ballroom tomorrow night, descending the grand staircase in front of hundreds of people, letting Garrett claim her publicly as his mate, while courtiers and nobles who had spent years hating her name watched. It was madness. It was suicide. It was the kind of desperate gamble that ended with dungeons or execution or war. But it was also the first real choice she had been offered in 10 years. The first chance to stop hiding. The first possibility of becoming someone other than the shadow who existed only in the spaces between other people's notice. Elena picked up the dress carefully, feeling the weight of it in her hands. The fabric was still perfect, despite years folded in a suitcase. Her mother had commissioned it from the finest dressmaker in the kingdom, insisting on the midnight blue because it made Elena's green eyes look like emeralds. "You will need this someday," her mother had said, helping her try it on for the first time. "When you attend your first real ball, when you dance with a man who sees you not as a princess, but as a woman worth knowing." Elena had been 15 then, still innocent enough to believe balls were for dancing and falling in love, not political maneuvering and strategic alliances. Still young enough to spin in front of the mirror, watching the skirt flare out like water, dreaming of fairy tales. 2 months later, her mother was dead. Elena set the dress down and picked up the emerald necklace instead, held it to the candlelight. The stone caught the flame and threw fractured green light across the walls. Her grandmother had worn this. Her mother had worn this. Queens who had ruled with wisdom and strength, who had made impossible decisions and survived impossible situations. The emerald had been in their family for 5 generations, a gift from a king to his mate, blessed by the moon goddess herself according to legend. It was said that the woman who wore it would know true strength when she needed it most, would find courage in impossible situations, would remember who she was even when the world tried to make her forget. Elena fastened it around her neck, feeling the familiar weight settle against her collarbone. She had worn it every day of her imprisonment, hidden beneath plain dresses, a secret reminder that she was still Princess Elena Ashford, even when Silas tried to erase her. And she had worn it every day since arriving in this kingdom, tucked beneath her maid's uniform where no one could see. A talisman, a promise to herself that someday she would reclaim everything that had been stolen. Maybe someday was tomorrow. If they could do it, maybe she could too. The decision settled over her like armor, heavy but necessary. Tomorrow night she would descend those stairs. She would let Garrett claim her. She would face the court and tell them the truth. And then she would see if a kitchen maid could remember how to be a princess, and if a princess could learn to be a queen. But first, she needed to survive one more night of being invisible. Elena carefully folded the dress and returned it to the suitcase, removed the necklace and wrapped it in soft cloth. Tomorrow they would see the light again. Tomorrow she would step out of the shadows. Tonight she would rest, gather her strength, prepare for the fire. Elena extinguished the candle and lay in the darkness, listening to the winter wind howl outside her window and trying not to think about all the ways this could go catastrophically wrong. But beneath the fear, beneath the uncertainty, something else was growing, something that felt dangerously like hope. Somewhere in the castle above, Garrett Stone stood at his window looking out over snow-covered grounds, his wolf restless beneath his skin, counting the hours until dawn when his mate would give him her answer. And in the shadows beyond the castle walls, Silas Mordain received word that his ultimatum had been delivered, and began moving his forces into position for the war he had been engineering for a decade. The pieces were in motion, the trap was set, and tomorrow night everything would change. Elena fell asleep with her hand pressed to her throat where the necklace had rested for 17 years, and dreamed of her mother's voice telling her that queens were not born in palaces, but forged in the fires of impossible choices. Tomorrow she would find out if she could withstand the heat. Dawn came too quickly. Elena stood before the cracked mirror in her tiny room. The midnight blue dress transformed her into someone she barely recognized. The woman staring back had her face, her green eyes, her golden hair now falling in waves past her shoulders, instead of twisted into the severe bun she had worn for 7 years. But everything else belonged to a ghost. The princess she had been at 15, before Silas locked her away. Before survival became her only goal, her hands trembled as she fastened the emerald necklace around her throat. The weight of it felt like a crown, like a noose, like both at once. 3 sharp knocks on her door made her jump. "Princess Elena," Marcus Thorne's voice carried through the old wood. "His Majesty is waiting." The walk to the great hall felt like a condemned prisoner's final march. Marcus led her through corridors that were already filling with nobility and courtiers, all dressed in their finest for what they believed would be a normal ball, a celebration. The announcement of their king's chosen bride from among the eligible noble ladies who had been preening and positioning themselves for months. They had no idea what was actually about to happen. Elena could feel their stares as she passed. Whispers erupted in her wake like small fires catching. Who is she? Where did she come from? Why is the spy master personally escorting a woman in a gown that costs more than most nobles earn in a year? The questions swirled around her, but Marcus's presence kept anyone from approaching directly. They reached the private antechamber adjacent to the great hall. Garrett waited inside, dressed in formal military regalia that emphasized the warrior beneath the king. Dark blue uniform with silver insignia marking every campaign he had commanded. Medals earned in blood rather than bestowed by politics. A sword at his hip that had seen actual combat, its worn grip testament to years of use. He looked at her and everything else in the room ceased to exist. "You came," he said simply. Elena lifted her chin, drawing on reserves of courage she was not sure she possessed. "I gave you my word, and I am tired of hiding." Garrett crossed to her in 3 strides and took both her hands in his. His grip was warm, steady, anchoring. "Beyond these doors are 300 people who believe they know who you are. Many of them will be angry. Some will call for your arrest. A few might demand war regardless of the truth." "I know. And you still want to do this?" Elena thought about the alternative. Running again. Hiding again. Spending the rest of her life looking over her shoulder while Silas used her name to threaten innocent people. She thought about her mother dying in that bed. About 7 years stolen. About the kingdom that should have been hers now twisted into something monstrous under a murderer's rule. "Yes," she said firmly. "I want to do this." Something fierce and proud flashed in Garrett's eyes. "Then stay close to me. Let me handle the initial reactions. And remember that no matter what happens in that room, you are under my protection. Anyone who threatens you answers to me." The doors to the great hall opened with a sound like thunder. Music stopped mid-phrase. Conversations died in waves spreading outward from the entrance. 300 faces turned toward them with expressions ranging from curious to shocked to openly hostile. Elena recognized several of them. Lord Blackwood, whose lands bordered the territory Silas had been making demands about for years. Lady Catherine, whose son had died in a border skirmish blamed on provocations from Elena's kingdom. Duke Marlowe, who had been pushing Garrett to take stronger military action against the supposed threats, all of them staring at the woman in the blue dress standing beside their king. Garrett's hand settled at the small of her back, a warm pressure that said, "I am here. We do this together." They walked into the hall side by side, their steps synchronized like soldiers marching into battle. The crowd parted automatically, creating a path to the raised dais where Garrett's throne sat. Elena kept her breathing steady, her shoulders back, her chin lifted. Every eye in the room tracked their progress. The whispers started again, louder now, speculation building like pressure before a storm. Garrett guided her to stand beside the throne rather than below it. A position of honor, of equality. The gesture did not go unnoticed. More whispers, more stares. He raised one hand and the hall fell silent with the kind of immediate obedience that came from years of successful military command. Members of the court, honored guests, nobles of the realm. His voice carried to every corner of the vast space without him needing to shout. "You were told this gathering would be an announcement regarding my choice of bride. That information was accurate. What you were not told is that the choice was made for me 7 years ago by forces beyond political alliance or strategic advantage. He turned to look at Elena, and the weight of his regard made her chest tighten. The woman standing before you is Princess Elena Ashford, daughter of the late Queen Catherine, rightful heir to the kingdom we have been told considers us an enemy. The hall erupted. Shouts of outrage, gasps of shock. Several nobles actually drew weapons before Garrett's guards moved to block them. Lord Blackwood's face went purple with rage. Lady Catherine looked like she might actually attack. Duke Marlowe was already pushing toward the dais, his hand on his sword hilt. Silence. Garrett's voice cracked through the chaos like a whip. The command in it, the raw alpha dominance, made even the angriest nobles freeze. When I give you leave to speak, you may voice your concerns. Until then, you will listen. The hall quieted, but the anger remained, a palpable presence thick enough to choke on. For 7 years, Garrett continued, you have been told that Princess Elena has been making demands, issuing threats, pushing our kingdoms toward war. You have been told that she is our enemy. You have been lied to. He stepped forward, positioning himself slightly in front of Elena, a subtle shift that proclaimed protection. The woman who has been signing those letters, making those demands, is not standing before you. Princess Elena has not issued a single threat. She has not made a single demand, because for 7 years she has been a prisoner, locked in her own castle by the mage Silas Mordain, who murdered her mother, stole her throne, and has been using her name as a weapon while keeping her existence secret. More murmurs, these ones less angry, more uncertain. 7 years ago, Princess Elena escaped that imprisonment at great personal risk. She came to our kingdom not as a spy or an enemy, but as a refugee seeking asylum. She has lived here in hiding, working in the castle kitchens, harming no one, threatening nothing. And I discovered her identity only because I recognized what she was the moment I saw her. He turned back to Elena, and his eyes held hers with an intensity that made her feel stripped bare and seen completely. Princess Elena Ashford is my mate, my Luna, the woman the moon goddess chose for me when I had given up believing I would ever find such a bond again. And as of this moment, she is under my personal protection. Any threat to her is a threat to me. Any attack on her is an attack on this throne. Any attempt to harm her will be met with the full force of this kingdom's military might. The silence that followed was absolute. Elena could hear her own heartbeat, could feel the weight of 300 stares, could sense the calculations happening behind noble eyes as they processed this information and tried to determine which way political winds would blow. Lord Blackwood was the first to speak, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. Your Majesty, with respect, you ask us to believe that the woman who has been threatening our borders for years is actually an innocent victim? That convenient timing, is it not? That she appears in our castle just as tensions escalate. She appeared 7 years ago. Marcus Thorne stepped forward from where he had been standing in the shadows. I have documentation of her arrival, testimony from the head cook who hired her, records of her work, and I have been investigating her identity for 6 months at His Majesty's request. Everything she has said is verifiable truth. That proves nothing, Duke Marlowe interjected. She could still be a spy, planted here deliberately to gain our king's trust. To what end? Garrett's voice went cold. If she were a spy, what has she accomplished in 7 years besides scrubbing dishes and avoiding notice? What intelligence has been leaked? What defenses compromised? What strategic advantage gained? Silence. Because there was no answer to that, Lady Catherine rose from her seat, her face etched with old grief. My son died because of border provocations from her kingdom. You ask me to simply forgive that? I ask you to direct your rage at the man who is actually responsible, Garrett said, and his voice gentled slightly. Silas Mordain killed your son, Lady Catherine. He engineered those provocations specifically to push us toward war. Princess Elena lost her mother to that same man's poison, She has suffered as you have suffered, and she is not your enemy." The older woman stared at Elena for a long moment, and something complicated moved behind her eyes. Then she sat down, saying nothing, but the tension in her shoulders eased fractionally. Others began voicing questions about proof, about verification, about what this meant for the kingdom's security. Garrett answered each one with the patience of a commander who had spent decades managing fractious military councils. Marcus provided documentation when needed, and through it all, Elena stood silent beside the throne, letting them examine her, judge her, question everything about her. It was Aldrich, one of the eldest council members, who finally asked the question everyone had been dancing around. "Your Majesty, if what you say is true, and we accept Princess Elena as your mate and future queen, what of Silas Mordane's ultimatum? He has given us 28 days to return her or face war. That deadline still stands." "Which is precisely why I am announcing this publicly tonight," Garrett said. "Silas expected me to either hand Elena over like a criminal or refuse and face war as if hiding a fugitive. I am doing neither. I am claiming her openly as my mate and making it clear that any attack on her is an attack on this kingdom. Silas can either back down and lose face, or he can openly declare war on an allied kingdom for the crime of protecting the rightful heir he has been oppressing." "That is a dangerous gamble, Your Majesty," Aldrich said slowly. "War was always coming," Garrett replied. "Silas has been maneuvering toward it for a decade. The only question was whether we would fight it on his terms or ours. I choose ours." He turned to face the full assembly, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the full weight of command. "I am claiming Princess Elena Ashford as my mate and future Luna before this court and before the moon herself. Those who accept this claim will stand in her defense. Those who cannot accept it may leave this court and this kingdom with my blessing, but you will not speak against her while under my protection. Is that understood?" One by one, nobles rose to their feet, some quickly, with expressions of acceptance or even approval, others more slowly, clearly conflicted. A handful remained seated for long moments before finally standing, their faces showing resignation rather than agreement. But they all stood, all except one. Victoria Thornwick remained in her chair, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. When every other person in the hall was on their feet, she finally rose with deliberate slowness. "How touching," she said, her voice carrying in the silence. "The king claims his mate. The court accepts. A beautiful story." She paused, her eyes finding Elena's across the room. "Pity it is all built on lies." Garrett's hand moved to his sword. "Lady Victoria, you were ordered confined to your quarters. How did you escape?" "Escape?" Victoria laughed, the sound bright and cutting. "Oh, Your Majesty, I did not escape. I was released by someone with far more authority than a few guards." She stepped forward, moving through the crowd that parted nervously before her. When she reached the base of the dais, she looked up at Garrett with something that might have been pity. "Did you never wonder why I took such an interest in a simple kitchen maid? Why I recognized her so quickly? Why I was so eager to expose her?" "Because you work for Silas Mordane," Garrett said. "We have already established that." "Oh, I do not work for him." Victoria's smile widened. "I am his daughter, which makes Princess Elena here my dear half-sister." The words hit Elena like a physical blow. The room spun. No, it was not possible. "Surprised?" Victoria tilted her head, studying Elena's face. "You did not know? Mother never told you about Father's other family? About the daughter he had before he ever met your precious queen?" "Lies," Elena managed, but her voice sounded weak even to her own ears. "Are they?" Victoria reached into her bodice and pulled out a folded letter. The handwriting was unmistakable. Silas's elegant script, the same that had signed orders and pronouncements throughout Elena's childhood. "Read it," Victoria said, tossing the letter toward the dais. It landed at Elena's feet. "Read what our father has to say about his two daughters and his grand plan to unite two kingdoms under his bloodline. Elena's hands shook as she picked up the letter. Garrett moved closer, reading over her shoulder. The words swam before her eyes, but certain phrases stood out with horrible clarity. My daughters, both precious in their own ways. Elena, the legitimate heir who will reclaim her throne. Victoria, the hidden blade who has opened every door. Together you will rule the kingdoms I have spent 20 years positioning for this moment. The letter went on, detailing how Silas had orchestrated everything. The marriage to Elena's mother to legitimize his claim, the slow poison that killed her, Elena's imprisonment to keep her safe until the time was right, Victoria's placement in Garrett's court to monitor threats and opportunities, and the final piece, the ultimatum designed not to force Elena's return, but to push Garrett into claiming her publicly. Because Silas wanted the kingdoms united through marriage. He wanted his bloodline on both thrones, and he had been patient enough to spend 2 decades arranging every piece. At the bottom of the letter, dated just 3 days prior, were the words that made Elena's stomach turn. Come home, daughter. It is time to stop this charade. I killed the king who called himself your father because he was weak. I killed the queen because she had served her purpose. But I never intended to harm you. You are my blood, my true heir. Everything I have done has been for you, for us, for the dynasty we will build together. Elena looked up at Victoria and saw her own green eyes reflected in her half-sister's face. The same shade, the same shape. How had she never noticed? Did you know? Elena asked, her voice barely above a whisper. When you tormented me as a child, did you know we shared a father? Not at first, Victoria said. But I learned eventually. And I understood that father loved you more because you were legitimate. Because your blood came with a crown. So I made myself indispensable in other ways. I became his spy, his weapon. The daughter who would do what needed to be done without hesitation. She turned to address the hall, her voice ringing with confidence. Silas Mordain is not the monster you believe him to be. He is a strategist who saw 2 kingdoms tearing themselves apart through generations of petty conflicts and territorial disputes. He unified them the only way possible, through bloodline and marriage, through his daughters. That is insane, Garrett said flatly. You are asking us to accept that murder and imprisonment and a decade of manufactured threats were all part of some grand unification plan. I am telling you that war was inevitable, Victoria replied. The only question was whether it would destroy both kingdoms or forge them into something stronger. Father chose the latter, and everything he has done, every piece he has moved, has been toward that end. She looked back at Elena. Come home, sister. Take your throne. Rule beside father as he always intended, and marry your mate here if you wish. Unite the kingdoms through the bond father engineered. Everyone gets what they want. Peace, prosperity, an end to decades of conflict. The offer hung in the air like poison. Elena looked at the letter still clutched in her shaking hands, looked at Victoria's face, so similar to her own, looked at Garrett standing beside her, his jaw tight with fury and his hand still resting on his sword. Looked at the assembled court watching this revelation unfold with expressions ranging from horror to fascination. Silas had planned everything, every move, every piece. He had killed her mother not out of simple greed, but as part of a strategy decades in the making. He had locked Elena away not to eliminate her, but to keep her safe until the time was right. He had used her name to create the very threats that would eventually push her into Garrett's arms. And the mate bond itself, the thing that had felt like fate, like the moon goddess's blessing, now felt like another manipulation. Had Silas somehow known? Had he arranged even that? No. The word came out stronger than Elena expected. It silenced Victoria mid-breath and made several nobles flinch. No, Elena repeated, and this time her voice carried the authority of someone who had spent 7 years learning to survive impossible situations. Silas Mordain did not engineer this bond. He did not plan for me to find my mate. He planned for me to be so broken by isolation that I would accept anything he offered just to escape that room. She stepped forward, moving past Garrett to stand at the edge of the dais, looking down at Victoria. You say he loves me. He murdered my mother. He stole 7 years of my life. He used my name to threaten innocent people. If that is love, then I want no part of it. Victoria's smile faltered. And you, Elena continued, years of suppressed rage finally finding its voice. You are my half-sister? Then you should understand better than anyone what kind of man our father is. You should know that power built on murder and lies is no power at all. It is just another kind of prison. She turned to face the court, addressing them directly for the first time. Silas Mordain wants me to come home and take my throne. He wants me to accept that everything he has done was necessary, that the ends justify the means, that I should be grateful for the kingdom he has kept warm for me while I rotted in that room for 7 years. Her hands clenched into fists. I will take back my throne. I will reclaim my kingdom, but I will do it by exposing him for what he is, by freeing the people he has oppressed, by showing them that their princess never abandoned them, never threatened anyone, never wanted anything but to serve them as my mother taught me. She looked at Garrett and found him watching her with something that looked like awe. And I will do it with my mate beside me. Not because Silas planned it, not because it serves some grand strategy, but because Garrett Stone is the first person in a decade who has offered me a choice instead of a cage, who has protected me without asking for anything in return, who makes me want to be brave instead of invisible. The silence that followed was different from before. This one felt less hostile, more contemplative. It was Aldrich who broke it, his weathered face thoughtful. Princess Elena, if what you say is true, and you intend to reclaim your throne from Silas Mordain, you will need more than courage and a mate bond. You will need an army, training, strategy, time. I know, Elena said quietly. Then I propose a solution, the old counselor continued. His Majesty mentioned that Silas gave us 28 days. I suggest we use that time to prepare Princess Elena not just to be our Luna, but to be the warrior queen her kingdom needs. Train her in combat, in tactics, in leadership. Show Silas that his daughter is not the broken girl who escaped 7 years ago, but a woman who has learned to survive and is ready to fight. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the hall. If she proves worthy, Aldrich said, then we support her claim. We help her retake her kingdom. And in doing so, we end the threat Silas poses to both realms. And if she proves unworthy, Duke Marlowe challenged, then I will step aside, Elena said before anyone else could answer. If I cannot earn the respect of this court, I have no business asking them to risk their lives for my kingdom. Garrett looked like he wanted to argue, but Elena touched his arm gently and he fell silent. I accept the trial, Elena said to the court. Give me your tests, your challenges. I will prove myself worthy of the throne I was born to claim and the mate the moon chose for me. The vote was not unanimous, but it was enough. 3/4 of the court agreed to give Elena 1 month to prove herself, to train, to learn, to transform from fugitive kitchen maid into warrior queen. As the assembly dissolved into smaller conversations and debates, Victoria approached the dais one final time. You think you can defeat him? She said quietly, meant only for Elena and Garrett to hear. You think a month of training and a mate bond will be enough? I think I am done underestimating myself, Elena replied. And I think you underestimate what I learned in that room. Silas taught me patience. Isolation taught me strength. And 7 years of surviving taught me that I am harder to break than he believes. Victoria's expression flickered with something that might have been respect. Father will not stop, she warned. He has been planning this for 20 years. 1 month will not be enough to undo that. Then we had better make the most of the time we have, Garrett said. Victoria studied them both for a long moment, then turned and walked away without another word. Guards followed her. She would be truly confined this time, in quarters that would be much harder to escape. When the hall finally cleared, when the last noble had departed and the servants had begun cleaning, Elena found herself alone with Garrett in the vast, empty space. "You did not have to accept their trial," he said quietly. "I would have supported your claim regardless." "I know," Elena replied. "But they were right. I am not ready to be queen. I do not know how to fight. I barely know how to shift. I have spent 7 years learning to be invisible. It is time I learned to be seen." Garrett smiled, that rare expression that transformed his entire face. "Then starting tomorrow we begin your training, and I promise you, Princess Elena Ashford, by the time this month is over, you will be ready to take back everything that was stolen from you." Elena looked up at this man who had offered her protection, partnership, and the first real choice she had been given in a decade. Her mate, her future, her chance at something beyond mere survival. "Starting tomorrow," she agreed. "But tonight, I just want to remember what it feels like to be myself, not a prisoner, not a kitchen maid, not a political pawn, just Elena." Garrett took her hand and raised it to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles that was both courtly and intimate. "Then tonight, you are just Elena," he said, "and I am just Garrett. And we are two people who found each other against impossible odds and chose to stand together." They stood in the empty hall holding hands, two people who should never have met, forging something new from the wreckage of old kingdoms and older wounds. Outside, snow began to fall again, covering the world in white silence. And in a castle 300 miles away, Silas Mordain received word that his daughter had rejected his offer and began preparing for the war he had always known would come. But this time the war would not be fought on his terms. This time his daughter would be the one setting the trap, and Garrett Stone, veteran of 20 years of border conflicts and master strategist, would be teaching her everything he knew about turning defensive positions into devastating victories. The month of training was about to begin, and nothing, not kingdoms or bloodlines or decades of manipulation, would ever be the same. The first lesson began before dawn. Elena woke to find Garrett in her doorway, wearing training leathers and carrying a wooden practice sword. "Get dressed," he said. "We start now." 15 minutes later she stood in the training yard, borrowed leathers fitting poorly, holding a blade that felt completely foreign. "You have never held a sword before," Garrett observed. "Silas preferred me helpless," Elena replied. "Then we begin at the beginning." He moved behind her, adjusting her grip. "Like this, your power comes from legs and core, not just arms." They drilled basic stance for 3 hours. When her legs shook, he made her hold longer. When she thought she would collapse, he told her that warriors who cannot stand cannot fight. By the time the sun rose, Elena's body screamed for mercy. Again Garrett said, "I cannot." "You can, because Silas will not wait for you to be ready. Because you told that court you would prove yourself. Words mean nothing without action." She held the stance 60 more seconds and discovered she was stronger than she believed. The pattern continued. Every dawn brought new lessons. Basic stances became strikes. Strikes became combinations. Elena fell dozens of times, got up dozens more. Her body accumulated bruises like badges. But she learned. Marcus Thorne took afternoons, teaching intelligence craft, how to read people, spot lies, gather information from casual conversation. One evening he set a test. 5 nobles, 1 working for Silas. 30 minutes to identify the traitor. Elena picked the right one in 15. "How did you know?" Marcus asked. "His eyes," she explained. "He looked at you too long, trying to convince himself he respected you. And his hands kept touching his signet ring. Nervous habit." Marcus smiled. "You have more talent than I expected, Princess." Evenings belonged to Aldrich and the counselors, teaching statecraft, tax policy, trade agreements, the machinery of governance beyond simple power. And nights, when training ended, Elena studied military history. She learned about Thornmere Pass, where Garrett turned ambush into victory using terrain, about Blackwater Keep, holding against forces 10 times his size, about the campaign that ended the 20-year war through strategy rather than overwhelming force. Garrett Stone won through preparation and seeing 3 moves ahead. Elena absorbed every lesson. 2 weeks in, something shifted. 20 elite guards stood across the training field. Garrett announced her test. Retrieve the red flag from the far end and return it, 30 minutes. 20 trained warriors against one woman with 2 weeks training. Impossible. Elena studied the field, saw defensive formations blocking every route, saw gaps that were traps. Then she sat down and closed her eyes. "What are you doing?" a guard called. "Waiting," Elena replied. "For you to get bored." Garrett laughed quietly. He understood. The guards did not. At 20 minutes, 2 on the eastern flank had moved together, talking. A gap opened. Elena moved fast, using speed her conditioning had built. Dropped and rolled through their perimeter before they adjusted. More guards converged. She did not fight them, just stayed ahead using what Marcus taught her about reading movements. A hand caught her arm at the flag. Elena twisted, broke the grip, stumbled forward with fingers closing on red cloth. 20 guards piled on her. She kept the flag wrapped around her wrist. They could not break her grip without real force. "Time," Garrett called. Elena lay on the ground, bruised and dirty, but the flag was locked in her hands. "You did not fight them," Garrett observed, pulling her upright. "I could not win that way, so I did not try." Elena straightened despite aching ribs. "It is what you did at Thornmere Pass." Something fierce flashed in his eyes. "You have been studying. Training intensified after that. Pack tactics, intelligence work, diplomatic negotiation under pressure. Over 3 weeks, Elena transformed. The timid maid burned away, revealing someone harder underneath. Someone who had always existed but never had permission to emerge. The court saw it too. Nobles who had been hostile at the ball began showing grudging respect. Warriors who had doubted her started nodding acknowledgement when she passed. Even Duke Marlowe, one of her harshest critics, admitted she was showing promise. But it was the morning of day 23 when everything changed again. Elena arrived at the training yard to find Garrett already there, but instead of practice weapons, he held 2 real swords. The steel gleamed in the dawn light, edges sharp enough to kill. "Today you learn about the cost of combat," he said quietly. "Because knowing how to fight and being willing to fight are very different things." He handed her one of the swords. The weight of it was different from the practice blade, more balanced, more lethal. "I am going to attack you," Garrett continued, "not at full strength, but enough that it will hurt when you fail to defend properly. Enough that you will bleed if you are careless. Enough that you will understand what real combat feels like." Elena's heart hammered, but she nodded. She took her stance, the movement automatic now after weeks of practice. Garrett attacked. It was nothing like their practice sessions. He was faster, harder, relentless. Elena blocked the first strike through muscle memory. The second drove her back 3 steps. The third nearly disarmed her. She countered instinctively, using a combination she had drilled 1,000 times. Garrett's blade slipped past her guard, and the flat of it cracked against her ribs hard enough to make her gasp. "In a real fight, that would have been your death," he said. "Reset." They went again. And again. Elena took 12 hits that would have been fatal if Garrett had used the edge instead of the flat. Her ribs bruised, her forearms ached from blocking, her hands blistered from gripping the unfamiliar weight, but she kept fighting. And somewhere around the 20th exchange, something clicked. Elena stopped thinking about individual moves and started seeing the pattern. The rhythm of attack and defense, the way Garrett telegraphed his intentions through tiny shifts in weight and positioning. She saw an opening and took it. Her blade slipped through his guard and stopped a hair's breadth from his throat. They froze, both breathing hard, the edge of her sword resting against his skin. "Good," Garrett said quietly. "Now finish it." Elena's hand shook. "This is practice. In practice, you learn to commit, to follow through, to understand that hesitation in real combat means death." His eyes held hers. "Finish it." Elena pressed the blade forward just enough to dimple skin without breaking it. Enough to understand that she could. That the line between practice and killing was measured in inches and intention. Then she pulled back, lowering the sword. "That is the difference between knowing and doing," Garrett said. "Between training and war. When the time comes, you cannot hesitate. Not against Silas, not against anyone who threatens what you are trying to protect." "I understand." "Do you?" because understanding intellectually and being able to act in the moment are very different things. He sheathed his sword. 3 weeks ago, you could barely hold a stance. Now you can fight well enough to survive. But survival is not victory. Victory requires the will to hurt others before they hurt you. Then teach me, Elena said. Teach me to be ruthless when I need to be. Garrett studied her for a long moment. Then he smiled that rare smile that transformed his face. You are already learning. Come. We have 1 more week before the deadline. Let us make sure you are ready for whatever comes next. Day 23 brought a shift. Elena arrived to find Garrett holding 2 real swords, edges sharp enough to kill. Today you learn about the cost of combat, he said. Knowing how to fight and being willing to are different things. He handed her a sword, the weight different from practice blades, more balanced, more lethal. I am going to attack you. Not at full strength, but enough to hurt when you fail. Enough to make you bleed if careless. Elena's heart hammered. She took her stance. Garrett attacked. Nothing like practice. Faster, harder, relentless. Elena blocked through muscle memory, countered instinctively. His blade slipped past her guard and cracked her ribs. In real combat, that would be death, he said, reset. 20 exchanges later, something clicked. Elena stopped thinking about moves and started seeing patterns. The rhythm, the way Garrett telegraphed through tiny weight shifts. She saw an opening, took it. Her blade stopped at his throat. Good, Garrett said. Now finish it. Elena's hand shook. This is practice. In practice, you learn to commit. To understand hesitation means death. His eyes held hers. Finish it. She pressed forward just enough to dimple skin. Enough to understand she could. That the line between practice and killing was measured in inches. Then pulled back. That is the difference, Garrett said, between training and war. When the time comes, you cannot hesitate. That final week blurred in training and preparation. And in quiet moments when the castle slept, Elena found herself in Garrett's war room studying maps. One night he spoke about his first mate, Sarah. She died 10 years ago. Border raid. Silas's forces. Though we did not know then. She held them so her team could escape. No one left to save her. I am sorry, Elena said. For years, I thought I would never feel that bond again. And then your scent drove my wolf insane. He looked at her. 2 people who thought they would never trust, learning to build something unbreakable. They sat holding hands across battle plans. 2 damaged people choosing to be whole together. The deadline arrived with the first full moon of spring. 28 days after Garrett's public claiming, after 3 weeks of brutal training and 1 week of final preparation, Silas Mordain's response arrived. It came not as a letter, but as an emissary. A man in dark robes who rode through the gates under a white flag of parley and demanded an audience with the king. Garrett received him in the throne room with full court in attendance. Elena stood beside him, no longer in kitchen rags or hiding in shadows, but dressed in leathers that bore the royal crest, a sword at her hip, every inch the warrior princess she had become. The emissary's message was simple and devastating. Lord Silas Mordain thanks His Majesty for the return of his daughter's confidence, the man said, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall. He is pleased that she has learned to fight, that she has found her strength, because strong daughters make strong heirs. He paused, letting the words sink in. However, Lord Silas regrets that His Majesty has misunderstood the situation. Princess Elena is not a refugee. She is his daughter, his blood. And while he respects the mate bond, he cannot allow her to remain in enemy territory where she might be used against him. Therefore, Lord Silas offers one final opportunity. Princess Elena may return home voluntarily with her mate if she wishes, to take her rightful place as heir to both kingdoms. Or, if she refuses, Lord Silas will be forced to retrieve her by whatever means necessary. The court erupted in angry murmurs. Garrett raised a hand for silence. You may tell Silas Mordain, Garrett said, his voice cold and precise, that Princess Elena is exactly where she chooses to be, under my protection, in my kingdom, as my mate and future queen. And if he wishes to challenge that, he is welcome to try. The emissary smiled. Lord Silas anticipated that response, which is why he has already mobilized his forces. 15,000 men stand ready to march. They will cross your borders in 3 days unless Princess Elena is returned. 15,000, Aldrich breathed. Your Majesty, we can field perhaps 8,000 on short notice. Numbers are not everything, Garrett replied. He looked at the emissary. Tell Silas that if he wants war, he will have it, but it will not be the easy victory he expects. The emissary bowed and withdrew. When he was gone, when the doors had closed and the court had erupted into panicked discussion, Elena felt the weight of what was coming settle over her like a shroud. This was her fault. Her presence here had brought this war to Garrett's doorstep. She must have spoken the thought aloud because Garrett turned to her, his eyes fierce. This war was always coming, he said. Silas has been maneuvering toward it for years. You did not cause this. You just gave us a reason to fight beyond simple border disputes. But your people will die because of me. My people will fight because it is right, Garrett corrected. Because you are worth fighting for. Because sometimes the only way to stop a tyrant is to meet his threat with overwhelming force and the will to use it. He turned to address the court. We have 3 days to prepare. Marshal our forces. Fortify our positions, and teach Silas Mordain that threatening this kingdom was the last mistake he will ever make. The court roared approval, and Elena, standing beside her mate, felt the last pieces of her old self finally burn away. The kitchen maid was gone. The prisoner was gone. Even the frightened princess was fading. In their place stood someone new, someone forged in training yards and war rooms and impossible choices. Someone ready to fight for what was hers. The war was coming, and Elena Ashford would meet it standing beside her mate, sword in hand, fear transformed into fury and purpose. Let Silas come. She would be ready. 3 days was not enough time to prepare for war, but 3 days was what they had, so Garrett Stone made every hour count. The war room became command center. Maps covered every surface, marked with troop positions, supply lines, defensive choke points. Messengers arrived hourly, with reports from scouts watching Silas's forces mass at the border. 15,000 men, just as the emissary had promised. Infantry, cavalry, and something worse. Mages. Silas had recruited dark practitioners from across the continent, promising them power and plunder in exchange for their service. Garrett stood over the central map, his command staff arrayed around him. Veterans all, men who had fought through the 20-year war and survived because they knew how to think tactically under pressure. We have 8,000, Duke Marlowe said flatly, against 15,000. Those are brutal odds, Your Majesty. Numbers are not everything, Garrett replied, his finger tracing defensive positions on the map. Silas is expecting us to meet him in open battle. Give him the field engagement where his superior numbers become overwhelming advantage. We will not give him that. What are you proposing? Aldrich asked. Garrett looked at Elena, who stood beside him studying the map with the intensity of someone who had spent 3 weeks absorbing military strategy. What do you see, Princess? Elena leaned over the map, her eyes tracking the terrain features Garrett had marked. Narrow passes here and here. The river creates a natural barrier on the eastern approach. And this valley, she pointed to a depression in the landscape 3 miles from the border. If they commit forces here, they cannot bring their full strength to bear. The terrain limits them. Exactly, Garrett said, and pride flashed in his eyes. We do not fight where Silas is strongest. We force him to fight where we control the battlefield. He began laying out the strategy with the methodical precision of a commander who had spent 20 years winning battles through preparation rather than luck. Defensive positions in the high ground overlooking the valley. Archers positioned to create killing fields in the narrow passes. Heavy infantry holding choke points where superior numbers meant nothing. And the elite guard, his wolves, mobile and ready to exploit any opening Silas gave them. The beauty of the plan was its simplicity. Force multiplication through terrain. Every archer worth 3 men because of positioning. every swordsman worth 5, because the enemy could not bring more than 1 or 2 against him at a time. It was the same strategy Garrett had used at Thornmere Pass, scaled up and adapted to different ground. But Marcus raised the concern they were all thinking. What about the mages? If Silas has recruited dark practitioners, as the reports suggest, they can bypass our defensive positions with ranged attacks. Fire, lightning, curses that ignore terrain advantages. Elena spoke before Garrett could respond. Then we need our own countermeasures. Do we have any practitioners in the kingdom who can shield our forces? A few, Aldrich admitted. Court mages, healers, none with the kind of combat experience Silas's mercenaries will bring. Then we use what we have, Elena said, and her voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had learned to make hard decisions. Position the healers with the heavy infantry where casualties will be highest. The court mages focus on defensive shields rather than offensive magic, and we trust that Silas's mages are mercenaries motivated by coin rather than loyalty. The moment the battle turns against them, they will break. It was sound reasoning. Mercenaries fought for pay, not conviction. They could be counted on to do their job as long as victory looked likely. But the moment things went badly, they would vanish like smoke. Garrett nodded slowly. Good. Marcus, make sure our intelligence network spreads word among Silas's mercenary companies that we are offering amnesty to any who lay down arms before the fighting starts. Plant doubt. Make them question whether the coin Silas is paying is worth dying for. The planning continued for hours. Supply chains verified to ensure troops would have food, water, medical support. Evacuation routes planned in case retreat became necessary. Messenger systems established so orders could flow from command to individual units. The 1,000 unglamorous details that separated professional military operations from chaotic brawls. Elena absorbed it all, asking questions when concepts were unclear, offering suggestions when she saw opportunities. And slowly, the commanders who had been skeptical of her just weeks ago began treating her observations with the same respect they gave Garrett's. She had earned that respect, not through birthright or mate bond, but through demonstrating tactical thinking and willingness to learn. When the council finally dispersed, Duke Marlowe lingered behind. "Your Majesty, Princess." A word. Garrett tensed slightly. The Duke had been one of Elena's harshest critics at the ball. "What is it, Marlowe? I wanted to say that I was wrong about you, Princess." The Duke met Elena's eyes directly. "I thought you were a threat, a spy. I called for your arrest. I apologize." Elena studied him for a moment. "You did what you thought was right to protect your kingdom. That is not something requiring apology." "Perhaps," Marlowe said. "But I let anger over my nephew's death in the border conflicts blind me to who was actually responsible. Silas manipulated us all for years. I should have seen it sooner." He paused. "My men will fight for you tomorrow, not because they are ordered to, but because they believe you are worth fighting for." After he left, Elena turned to Garrett. "That meant something. It meant you have won over one of my most difficult commanders." Garrett pulled her close. "It meant that the court sees what I saw the moment you walked into that ballroom, that you were born to lead." It was night before all the preparations were complete. Soldiers bedded down in the fields around the castle, trying to sleep before the march at dawn. Officers made final checks of equipment and supplies, and in the castle, the commanders gathered for one last briefing. Garrett stood before them, his command presence filling the room even though he spoke quietly. "Tomorrow we face an enemy that outnumbers us nearly 2-1, an enemy led by a man who murdered his way to power and has spent a decade threatening our security. Some of you have lost family to Silas's provocations. Some carry scars from battles we thought were isolated incidents, but now know were part of his larger strategy." He paused, letting that sink in. "But tomorrow is not about revenge. It is about justice. It is about ensuring that tyrants like Silas Mordain cannot hold kingdoms hostage through fear and manipulation. It is about protecting the people who depend on us to stand between them and those who would do them harm. His eyes found Elena across the room. "And it is about proving that sometimes the bravest thing is standing up for someone who needs protection. Princess Elena could have stayed hidden, could have remained safe in the shadows. Instead, she chose to stand and be counted, to face her fears and the man who tried to break her. That takes more courage than any of us will show on the battlefield tomorrow." The commanders nodded. Several touched fists to chests in salute. "Tomorrow we show Silas what it means to threaten this kingdom," Garrett concluded. "We show him that people united by choice are stronger than armies held together by fear. And we remind him that tactical brilliance beats raw numbers every single time." The briefing ended. The commanders dispersed to their units, and Elena found herself alone with Garrett once again. "You are thinking about the casualties," Garrett said quietly. "How can I not?" Elena stared at the map, at the positions marked for their soldiers. "How many will die because I came here?" "Wrong question." Garrett turned her to face him. "The right question is how many will be saved because you are giving them something worth fighting for. A chance to end Silas's threat permanently, a future where kingdoms are not held hostage by tyrants who murder their way to power." His hands framed her face, forcing her to meet his eyes. "Soldiers do not fight because they are ordered to. They fight because they believe the cause is just, because they trust their commanders, because they would rather die standing than live kneeling. Your presence here did not create this war. Silas did. You are just giving us a reason to finish it." The words should have comforted her. Instead, they made the responsibility feel heavier. That night, Elena could not sleep. She stood at her window watching torches move in the courtyard below as soldiers prepared equipment, sharpened weapons, wrote final letters to families they might never see again. A knock at her door. "Come in," she called without turning. Marcus Thorne entered carrying a wooden box. "Princess, I thought you should have this." He set the box on her table and opened it. Inside lay a sword, but not a practice blade. This was real steel, the metal worked with intricate patterns that caught the candlelight. The hilt was wrapped in leather worn smooth by use. "It belonged to Garrett's first mate," Marcus explained. "Sarah. She carried it through a dozen battles. He has kept it all these years. Tonight he asked me to give it to you." Elena's throat tightened. "I cannot take this." "He wants you to have it." Marcus met her eyes. "Because she would have wanted you to have it. Because it represents what you are fighting for. The right to choose your own path. The strength to defend what matters." Elena lifted the sword from its box. The weight felt right in her hand, balanced perfectly. She could feel the history in it, the battles it had seen, the woman who had wielded it. "Tell him thank you," she said quietly. "Tell him yourself," Marcus replied. "He is waiting in the war room. I think he needs to see you before tomorrow comes." She found Garrett alone with the maps, but he was not studying strategy. He was just standing there, staring at nothing, his shoulders carrying the weight of 8,000 lives he would be leading into combat. Elena crossed the room and wrapped her arms around him from behind, pressing her face between his shoulder blades. For a long moment, neither spoke. "I sent the deployment orders an hour ago," Garrett said finally. "By dawn, everyone will be in position. After that, we wait for Silas to make his move." "Are you afraid?" "Terrified." His hands covered hers where they rested against his chest. "Every time I send soldiers into battle, I am afraid. Afraid I missed something. Afraid my strategy has a flaw I did not see. Afraid that the men who trust me will die because I made a mistake." "That is what makes you a good commander," Elena said. "Bad commanders do not fear those things." Garrett turned in her arms to face her. "Whatever happens tomorrow, whatever comes, I need you to know something. Finding you was worth it. This war, the risk, all of it. You were worth waiting for." Elena kissed him then, pouring everything she could not say into the contact. Fear and hope and determination all tangled together. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. "Promise me something," she said. "Promise me you will come back." "I cannot promise that. War does not work that way." "Then promise me you will fight like hell to come back. Promise me you will not throw your life away trying to protect me from the consequences of my choices." Garrett smiled. that rare expression that transformed his entire face. "That I can promise. Now come. If this is our last night before battle, I would rather spend it with you than staring at maps I have already memorized." They left the war room and climbed to the highest tower of the castle, where the night air was cold and sharp, and the stars blazed overhead like diamonds scattered across black velvet. They sat together wrapped in a single cloak, watching the sky slowly lighten toward dawn. Neither slept. There would be time for sleep later if they survived. When the sun finally broke the horizon, Garrett stood and offered Elena his hand. "Ready?" "Ready," she lied. They descended to find the castle transformed into a military encampment. Soldiers in formation, horses saddled and ready, supply wagons loaded, the machine of war fully engaged and waiting for its commander. Garrett mounted his war horse, a massive black stallion bred for combat. Elena swung up onto her own mount, a smaller but equally fierce mare. Around them the elite guard assembled. 20 wolves in human form, all carrying the tension of warriors about to shift into battle mode. The march to the valley took 3 hours. Elena used the time to review everything Garrett had taught her. Terrain analysis, defensive positioning, how to read the flow of combat, how to spot when formations were beginning to break. They crested the final ridge and the valley spread below them. Garrett had chosen well. The depression funneled any attacking force into narrow approaches where numbers meant nothing. The high ground gave their archers clear fields of fire, and the river to the east prevented flanking maneuvers. It was a killing field dressed up as a valley. The army began taking positions, infantry to the center and flanks, archers on the heights, cavalry held in reserve for counterattacks. The elite guard with Garrett at the command position where they could respond to threats anywhere on the battlefield. And they waited. Silas's forces appeared at midday, first as a dust cloud on the horizon, then as individual formations becoming visible, infantry in disciplined columns, cavalry on the wings, and at the center, robed figures that could only be the mages Silas had recruited. Elena felt her stomach clench. 15,000 men, maybe more, a force large enough to overwhelm them through sheer weight of numbers if Garrett's strategy failed. They stopped at the valley entrance, just out of arrow range. For long minutes nothing happened. Both armies stood facing each other across empty ground, the tension building like pressure before a storm. Then a single rider emerged from Silas's lines, carrying a white flag of parley. Garrett cursed under his breath. "He is going to try to negotiate, try to make us look unreasonable if we refuse." "Then we negotiate," Elena said, "but on our terms." They rode down to meet the emissary in the neutral ground between the armies. Up close, Elena recognized him. Roderick, captain of Silas's personal guard, the man who had tried to capture her in the forest a month ago. His eyes widened when he saw her. "Princess Elena, you look different. 3 weeks of training will do that," Elena replied coolly. "What does Silas want?" "Lord Silas offers one final chance for peace," Roderick said formally. "Return Princess Elena to her rightful place as heir to her kingdom. Accept a treaty of alliance between your realms, and avoid the bloodshed that will otherwise occur today." "The treaty terms?" Garrett asked. "Territorial concessions," Roderick began listing them. Trade agreements weighted heavily in Silas's favor. Reduction of your military forces, acceptance of Silas's advisors in your court, and of course, Princess Elena's immediate return. "So complete capitulation dressed up as negotiation," Garrett said flatly. "The answer is no." Roderick's expression hardened. "Then Lord Silas regrets that you have chosen war." He turned his horse to leave. "Wait," Elena called. "I have a counteroffer." Both men turned to look at her. "Tell Silas that I challenge him to single combat, under the ancient laws that govern our bloodline. If he defeats me, I will return willingly, and your army can withdraw without a fight. If I defeat him, he surrenders his false claim to my throne and faces justice for my mother's murder." Roderick stared at her like she had lost her mind. "You challenge Lord Silas, a trained mage and warrior who has killed dozens in combat? You have been learning to fight for 3 weeks. 3 weeks with the best teacher on the continent, Elena replied, glancing at Garrett. And I am willing to bet my life that Silas is a coward who will refuse to face me in fair combat. A slow smile spread across Roderick's face. You think he will refuse? I think he has spent decades hiding behind manipulation and poison because he lacks the courage for honest confrontation. Prove me wrong. Roderick wheeled his horse and galloped back to Silas's lines. What are you doing? Garrett hissed. You cannot fight Silas in single combat. He will kill you. Maybe, Elena said. Or maybe he will refuse and show his entire army that he is afraid of a woman who has been training for 3 weeks. Either way, we win something. They rode back to their lines and waited. An hour passed, then another. The sun climbed higher, beating down on soldiers in full armor, sweat soaking into leather and chainmail. Finally, movement from Silas's forces. Not Roderick this time. Silas himself, riding a white stallion and wearing robes that seemed to drink the sunlight. He stopped in the neutral ground and his voice carried across the valley through some magical amplification. My daughter makes a bold challenge. Very well, I accept. But not here, not on ground chosen by her protector. She wants single combat. Let her come to the ancient circle 3 miles north, the place where our bloodline has settled disputes for generations. There, before witnesses from both armies, we will see if she has the strength to back her words. It was a trap. Had to be. The ancient circle was neutral ground, but it was also isolated. Easier to control, easier to manipulate. Do not do this, Garrett said quietly. There is no honor in what he is offering, only death. Elena turned to face him fully. If I do not go, he will use it to demoralize your soldiers, make them question whether they are fighting for a coward. And if I go and he kills me, you still have the high ground here. You can still win this battle. That is not acceptable. Garrett. She took his hands. I have to do this. Not because I think I can win, but because sometimes the only way to expose a monster is to stand in front of him and refuse to blink. For a long moment, Garrett said nothing. Then he turned to his command staff. Prepare to move to the ancient circle. Full escort. If Silas tries anything, we end him and his entire army. The march to the ancient circle took an hour. The place was exactly as the name suggested. A perfect ring of standing stones, weathered by centuries, arranged in a circle 60 feet across. Neutral ground since before the kingdoms were founded. Both armies assembled outside the circle, creating 2 semicircles of armed watchers. The tension was a physical presence, thick enough to choke on. Elena dismounted and walked toward the circle. Garrett walked beside her, the elite guard fanning out in protective formation. At the circle's edge, Silas waited. Elena saw him clearly for the first time in 7 years. He looked older. Gray had threaded through his dark hair. New lines creased his face, but the eyes were the same, sharp, calculating, utterly certain of his own superiority. Daughter, he said, and his voice carried warmth that made her skin crawl. You have grown, become strong, exactly as I knew you would. Do not call me daughter, Elena said. You killed my mother. You stole my kingdom. You locked me in that room for 7 years. You are nothing to me. Silas smiled. Such fire, such strength. You inherited more of me than I expected. Perhaps that weakling king contributed nothing useful after all. Elena felt Garrett tense beside her, hand moving toward his sword. She touched his arm gently. This is my fight, she said quietly. Please, let me do this. Garrett's jaw clenched, but he stepped back. I will be right here. The moment this goes wrong, the moment he tries anything, I am ending this. Elena nodded and stepped into the circle. The ancient stones seemed to pulse with power as she crossed the threshold. Old magic, older than kingdoms, the kind that enforced rules and punished those who broke them. Silas entered from the opposite side. In the center of the circle, they faced each other. The rules are simple, Silas said loudly for both armies to hear. Single combat to first blood, submission, or death. No weapons beyond what we carry. No outside interference. And the loser accepts the victor's terms without argument. Agreed, Elena said. Silas drew his sword with a flourish. The blade shimmered with enchantment, runes glowing along its length. Dark magic that had probably been used to kill Elena's mother. Elena drew Sarah's sword. No enchantments, just good steel and the weight of memory. They circled each other slowly. Silas moved with the confidence of a man who had trained for decades. Elena moved with the caution of someone who had trained for 3 weeks and knew exactly how outmatched she was. The first exchange happened so fast Elena barely registered it. Silas's blade came in high, a probing strike testing her defense. Elena blocked automatically, muscle memory from hundreds of practice sessions with Garrett taking over. The impact jolted through her arms, the raw power behind Silas's strike making her realize just how much stronger he was. Silas smiled. Good. You at least know how to hold a blade. This will not be completely boring. He attacked again, and this time the strikes came in combinations. High, low, faint left, then strike right. Each movement flowing into the next with practiced ease. This was a man who had killed dozens in single combat, who had trained since childhood in the deadly art of blade work. Elena gave ground, blocking desperately, using everything Garrett had taught her. Footwork, positioning, reading attacks through body language and weight shifts. She managed to deflect 4 strikes, 5, 6. The 7th got through. Silas's blade opened a cut across her forearm, not deep but deliberate. Blood welled immediately, running down to her wrist. First blood, Silas announced, pulling back slightly. You should yield now, daughter. Before this gets ugly. You have proven you are brave. That is enough. Elena looked at the blood running down her arm, felt the sting of it, heard the murmurs from both armies watching, some expecting her to yield, others hoping she would continue. Then at Garrett standing outside the circle, his entire body coiled like a spring ready to snap. She could feel his wolf through their bond, raging against the ancient laws that prevented him from intervening, his every instinct screaming to protect his mate. But Elena had not come here to be protected. No, she said, raising her sword again. First blood is not surrender. We keep fighting. The watching soldiers erupted in cheers and shouts. Garrett's forces roaring approval. Even some of Silas's mercenaries looking impressed despite themselves. Silas's smile vanished completely. Very well, you chose this. He attacked again, and this time there was no mercy in it. No testing, no probing. Pure aggression designed to overwhelm and destroy. Each strike came with killing intent, a thrust aimed at her heart, a slash targeting her throat, a low sweep meant to hamstring her. Elena blocked what she could, dodged what she could not block, and took hits she could not avoid. The cuts accumulated. A slash across her shoulder that made her left arm go partially numb. A thrust that slipped past her guard and would have taken her in the ribs if she had not twisted at the last instant, turning a killing blow into a glancing wound. Her breathing turned ragged. Her arms felt like lead. But she kept fighting, and somewhere in the desperate defense, a pattern emerged. Silas was faster, stronger, more skilled, but he was also predictable. He fought with the arrogance of someone who had never faced a real challenge, who had spent decades overwhelming opponents through raw power and superior technique. He favored high attacks, coming in over the guard rather than under it. He put slightly more weight on his right foot, telegraphing which direction he would move, and he had a tell, a barely perceptible pause before his strongest strikes, like a snake coiling before it struck. Elena started watching for those tells, started anticipating instead of just reacting. She could not match his speed or power, but she could read him, predict where he would be a heartbeat before he got there. Another strike came in, the kind that had been overwhelming her. This time Elena was ready. She sidestepped instead of blocking, letting Silas's momentum carry him past. The movement created an opening, just a fraction of a second where his guard was compromised. Elena struck. Her blade slipped past his defenses and carved a line across his chest. Not deep. She did not have the strength or positioning for a killing blow, but enough. Enough to draw blood. Enough to prove she could touch him. Second blood. Silas staggered back, one hand going to his chest, coming away bloody, shock clear on his face. You actually landed a hit. I had a good teacher, Elena said through gritted teeth. Her wounds were screaming. Every movement hurt, but she held her ground. Rage transformed Silas's expression, the calm, confident mask cracking to reveal something uglier underneath. This had never been about testing her, about seeing if she was worthy. This was about domination, about proving she was still that helpless girl he had locked in that room, and she had just proven she was not. Silas raised his free hand, and power gathered there, dark and crackling. The enchantment on his sword flared brighter, runes glowing with malevolent light. Magic designed to kill, to burn, to destroy. No weapons beyond what we carry, Elena said, her voice cutting through the sudden tension. Magic counts as a weapon, Silas. If you use it, you break the ancient laws governing this circle. The stones will punish you. The standing stones pulsed with warning light. Old magic, older than kingdoms, absolute in its enforcement. The ancient laws were not suggestions. They were reality. Break them and face consequences beyond any mortal power to prevent. Silas looked at the glowing stones, at the power they represented. For a long moment he seemed to teeter on the edge of decision. Use magic and risk the stone's punishment, or continue fighting conventionally and risk losing to someone he had spent years believing was beneath him. Slowly, reluctantly, he lowered his hand. The dark power dissipated. The sword's enchantment dimmed back to mere enhancement rather than active magic, but his eyes promised murder. The fight continued with renewed brutality, Silas abandoning any pretense of honor or mercy. Every strike meant to maim, to break, to prove that even without active magic, he was still superior in every way that mattered. Elena gave ground steadily, her defensive circle growing smaller. She was exhausted, bleeding from a dozen cuts. Her arms felt like they weighed 100 pounds each, vision starting to blur from blood loss and fatigue. But she refused to fall, refused to give Silas the satisfaction of seeing her quit, refused to prove that 7 years of imprisonment had broken something in her that could never be fixed. And then, in the chaos of combat, she saw it, the pattern she had been looking for. The opening Garrett had taught her to recognize in their final week of training. That moment when an opponent overcommits to power, putting everything into a strike meant to end the fight in one blow. Silas wound up for exactly that kind of attack, his full weight behind it, his sword coming in at an angle designed to shatter her guard and take her head clean off. Elena did not try to block it. Instead, she dropped low, the blade whistling over her head close enough to feel the wind of its passing. Silas's momentum carried him forward, off balance, committed to a strike that had found only empty air. And in that heartbeat where he was vulnerable, Elena struck upward. Her sword took him in the thigh, angled perfectly to sever muscle and tendon. Deep, crippling. Silas went down with a scream, clutching the wound. Blood poured between his fingers, far more than the earlier cuts. This was serious injury, the kind that would leave him permanently damaged even with magical healing. Elena stood over him, sword pointed at his throat, breathing in ragged gasps that tore at her damaged ribs. Every inch of her body hurt. She was probably in shock from blood loss, but she was standing, and Silas was on the ground. "Yield," she said. "Never." Silas's hand moved, reaching for something concealed in his robes. Elena saw it emerge. A vial, small, crystal, filled with liquid that caught the light like poison, the same kind he had used on her mother. Recognition hit like a physical blow. After everything, after defeat, he was going to try to kill her with poison, the coward's weapon, the murderer's choice. He threw it. Elena twisted, but not fast enough. The vial shattered against her shoulder, the contents splashing across her skin and soaking into the fabric of her clothing. She felt it burn immediately, felt the poison trying to work its way into her bloodstream through cuts and scratches. This was the end. This was how Silas would win. Not through skill or honor, but through poison. just like he had won against her mother. But something unexpected happened. The mate bond flared to life. Not the gentle warmth of connection, but a blazing inferno of power. Garrett's strength pouring into her across their bond, his wolf lending her its vitality, burning the poison away before it could take hold. And something deeper awakened. The wolf Elena had always carried but never been able to call forth. 7 years of imprisonment had suppressed it, taught her to be small and quiet and invisible. But 3 weeks of training and 1 month of choosing to be brave had changed something fundamental. Her wolf surged to the surface fully for the first time. The shift happened fast. Bones rearranging with cracks that should have hurt but felt like freedom. Muscles expanding, reshaping. Golden fur erupting across her skin. Her senses sharpening until she could smell fear in Silas's sweat. Hear the racing heartbeats of thousands watching. Feel the power in the ancient stones around them. In seconds, the woman was gone and the wolf stood in her place, larger than any normal she-wolf had a right to be. Golden fur that shone like captured sunlight, green eyes blazing with intelligence and fury that was purely human despite the animal form. The crowd gasped. Both armies went silent. Even Garrett stared in awe. Silas looked up at the wolf looming over him, and horror transformed his face. No, you were broken. You could not shift. I made sure of it. The wolf spoke, and Elena's voice came from its throat, rough but perfectly understandable. You tried to break me. You failed. The wolf lunged. Silas threw up his hands, magic flaring desperately. But the ancient circle rejected it, the stones pulsing with power that smashed his enchantments like glass. Elena's jaws closed on his shoulder and drove him to the ground. She could kill him, easily. 1 bite to the throat and it would be over. But she did not. Instead, she shifted back to human form, kneeling over Silas's broken body, Sarah's sword at his throat. I could kill you, she said quietly. The way you killed my mother, the way you tried to kill me. But I am not you. I am better. She stood and raised her voice to carry to both armies. Silas Mordain is defeated. Under the ancient laws, he surrenders his false claim to my throne. He will face justice for murder, for tyranny, for every crime he has committed. And any who served him willingly will answer for their choices. She looked at Silas's army. Many were mercenaries. Some were conscripts forced into service. A few were true believers. But all of them had just watched their leader defeated by a woman who had been training for 3 weeks. Slowly, weapons began to lower. First 1, then 10, then hundreds. Silas's army was surrendering. It was Roderick who finally stepped forward, removing his sword belt and laying it at Elena's feet. We yield, Princess. The fight is over. Elena swayed on her feet, exhaustion and blood loss finally catching up. Before she could fall, Garrett was there, having crossed into the circle the moment the combat officially ended. He caught her, supporting her weight. I won, she managed. You did more than win, Garrett said, and awe colored his voice. You shifted, fully, in front of everyone. Elena looked down at herself, covered in blood, some hers, some Silas's, bruised and battered, but alive, victorious. The armies erupted in cheers. Garrett's soldiers celebrating, Silas's forces accepting their new reality with varying degrees of relief or resignation. Marcus appeared with medics. Elena's wounds were cleaned and bandaged. Silas was taken into custody, his injuries treated enough to keep him alive for trial. Victoria Thornwick emerged from Silas's army, hands bound, clearly a prisoner herself. She met Elena's eyes across the circle, and something complicated moved in her expression. Respect, perhaps even pride. Father underestimated you, Victoria said. I told him he would. He never listened. Why did he imprison you? Elena asked. Because I told him the truth, Victoria replied, that you were stronger than he believed, that manipulating you would fail. He called it betrayal. I called it honesty. She paused. For what it is worth, sister, I am glad you won. Elena did not know what to say to that, so she simply nodded and let the guards take Victoria away. The journey back to the castle took 2 days. Silas and his co-conspirators were tried publicly. The evidence was overwhelming: witness testimony, documents. Even Victoria gave testimony about Silas's crimes, including the truth Elena had not known. "It was I who administered the final dose of poison to your mother," Victoria said, her voice flat. "Father ordered it. Told me it was necessary. I was 15. I believed him. I have regretted it every day since." The verdicts were unanimous. Silas was sentenced to life imprisonment in the deepest dungeons, his assets seized, his magical abilities bound by powerful enchantments that would prevent him from ever using power again. Victoria received a lighter sentence: exile. She would be allowed to leave with her life and a small amount of coin, but she could never return to either kingdom. Before she left, she sought Elena out. "Thank you," Victoria said simply, "for not demanding my execution, for giving me a chance I do not deserve." Elena studied her half-sister. "We both spent our lives being used by Silas. You just figured it out sooner than I did. Go, find a life that is yours, not his." Victoria nodded and left without another word. The kingdoms began the process of unification. Treaties were drafted, territories redistributed fairly, laws harmonized. It was boring, tedious work that would take years to complete, but it was the work that mattered. Building something better from the ruins of what Silas had tried to create. 6 months after the battle, Elena stood in the throne room of her birth kingdom for the first time in 7 years, not as a prisoner, as its queen. The coronation was simple by royal standards, no excessive pageantry, just the formal recognition of what had always been true, that Elena Ashford was the rightful heir. Garrett stood beside her, and when the crown was placed on her head, he took her hand. 2 kingdoms united not through Silas's manipulation, but through choice, through love, through a mate bond that had survived imprisonment and war and impossible odds. That night, after the celebrations ended and the castle finally quieted, Elena found Garrett on the battlements, looking out over the lands they now ruled together. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, slipping under his arm. "How different everything is from 6 months ago," Garrett said. "How close we came to losing it all. How grateful I am that you were brave enough to stop hiding. I was terrified. Being brave and being terrified are not opposites." He kissed the top of her head. "You taught me that." Elena placed her hand over her stomach, where new life was just beginning to make itself known. In 7 months, there would be an heir, a child born of 2 bloodlines, 2 kingdoms, 2 people who had found each other against all odds. "What kind of world are we bringing them into?" she asked quietly. "A better one," Garrett said with certainty. "Not perfect, never perfect, but better, because you fought for it, because we built it together, because sometimes the only way to create something new is to burn away everything broken and start again."